Welcome to your first practical session on the central nervous system, which will focus on the cerebral cortex, sulci and gyri, and the important functional areas. First of all, we have to know the orientation of the cerebrum, which is the frontal lobe, which is the occipital loop. So, I will draw simple photo here about the cerebrum. So this is the frontal loop, this is the temporal loop, and this is the back of the brain here, which is the occipital loop. The occipital loop is the only loop which is pointing to the back of the brain, and we have two loops pointing to the front of the brain, the frontal loop and the temporal loop. So this is the frontal loop, this is the temporal loop. This loop here is the occipital loop of the brain. Here we have a notch called pre-occipital notch. This is the pre-occipital notch of the brain. And here we have another fissure, which is the parietal occipital. This parietal occipital is separating between the parietal loop in front and the occipital loop behind. If we draw imaginary line between the pre-occipital notch and the parietal occipital fissure, and here we have the lateral fissure of the brain. If we meet the lateral fissure of the brain with the imaginary line, which is joining between the parietal occipital fissure and the pre-occipital notch, we now have drawn the four loops of the brain. Another fissure here exactly in the center of the brain, which is the central sulcus. This central sulcus is very important landmark because it divides the cerebrum into frontal loop in front and parietal loop behind. So this is the frontal loop and this is the parietal loop. This is the occipital loop of the brain and this is the temporal loop of the brain. We have frontal pole. This is the frontal pole of the brain and this is the temporal pole of the brain, and here is the occipital pole of the brain. So we have two poles are directing to the anterior, and one pole, which is the occipital pole, is directing to the back of the brain. Okay, now we will focus about this loop here, which is the frontal loop. What are important sulci, gyri, and important functional areas? So this is the frontal loop of the brain here. This arrow is pointing to the frontal loop of the brain. This is the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus of the brain. In front of the central sulcus, one finger breadth, we will find another one parallel sulcus, which is the pre-central sulcus. This is the pre-central sulcus. And we have another sulcus here, like this. This is the superior frontal sulcus. Another one here. This is the inferior frontal sulcus. So we have four important sulci in the frontal loop: the precentral sulcus and the superior frontal and the inferior frontal sulcus. The important gyri in the frontal loop is this gyrus here, between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus. This gyrus is called the precentral gyrus. So this is the pre-central gyrus. And this one here, just above the superior frontal, is called the superior frontal sulcus. So gyrus. So this is the superior frontal gyrus. And this one here in the middle, between the superior and inferior frontal sulci is called the middle frontal gyrus, and lastly this one, which is lying below the inferior frontal sulcus, is called the inferior frontal gyrus. So we have precentral gyrus between the central and the precentral sulcus, and superior frontal gyrus just above the superior frontal sulcus, the middle frontal gyrus between the superior and the middle frontal and the inferior frontal sulcus, and the inferior frontal gyrus, which is lying below the inferior frontal sulcus. Now we will see the important areas which is located on the frontal lobe of the brain. Here we have the motor area of the body. This is the motor area of the body. You can see it is lying in the precentral gyrus, and the representation of the body is upside down, so that the head area is lying in the lowermost part of the precentral gyrus, and the trunk area in the middle part, and the lower limb area is lying on the upper part of the precentral gyrus, also extending on the first 1 centimeter on the medial surface of the brain, on a site called, or on a gyrus called paracentral lobule, which we will discuss later. So this area is very important, and it's called the motor area of the body. This area is controlling the whole motor movement of the body, and here we have an area very important which is called pyramidal area. Motor area 4. In front of this motor area 4, we have another area called premotor area. According to the Brodmann classification, it's called premotor area 6. This is the site of the extrapyramidal area, which controls broad movement and coordinate the coarse movement, mainly the trunk and shoulders and hip muscles. This area also is inhibitory to the muscle tone. As you can see, it is like inverted triangle with the base broad above here, and the apex is directed downward. It's just in front of the precentral gyrus, so you can see it's lying in the most posterior part of the superior frontal gyrus, and also the middle frontal gyrus. Sometimes it's extending to the inferior frontal gyrus as well. Just below to this area, we have here an area called the frontal eye field. This area here is called area 8 according to Brodmann classification, and it's called frontal eye field area. As you can see, it's lying mostly in the middle frontal gyrus. This area is connected to the visual area in the occipital loop, as we will see when we are discussing the occipital loop. We will see this connection, how this connection is occurring. The function of this area is voluntary tracking movement, or you can see conjugate movement of both eyes to the opposite side. Just below to this area, we have a very important area here, which is lying in the inferior frontal gyrus. This area is called Broca's area, or area 44. It's called Broca's area or motor area of speech, area 44. It's lying in the inferior frontal gyrus, and it's mainly on the left dominant hemisphere. The function of this area is coordinating of the whole muscles that produce speech, as the muscles of the larynx, mouth, tongue, and palate. This area, because it's linked to the speech, it has to be connected to another area which we will discuss in the parietal loop, which is called Fornix Area, through a fasciculus called arcuate fasciculus. And if this area is lesioned, it will cause a phenomena called motor aphasia or motor aphasia. This is the disease in which the patient cannot articulate his muscles of speech to produce fluent speech, so it's called non-fluent aphasia. Another name for the lesion is called non-fluent aphasia. Now we will see the sulci, gyri, and the important functional areas on the parietal loop. So the parietal loop is extending between this sulcus, which is the central sulcus, as we mentioned before, central sulcus, and another fissure here, which is the parieto-occipital fissure, which is the which separates the parietal loop above or in front and the occipital loop behind this fissure. So this imaginary line which joins between the lateral fissure and the parieto-occipital, and this is the second imaginary line which joins the pre-occipital notch with the first imaginary line. Here we draw the parietal loop of the brain. So this is the parietal loop of the brain. What are the sulci, gyri, and important functional areas on the parietal loop? So just behind the central sulcus, we can draw another sulcus here, which is the post-central sulcus. So this sulcus is exactly lying 1 finger breadth behind the central sulcus, and between this sulcus and the central sulcus we will see an important area of the brain, which we will discuss in a minute. Another sulcus or fissure, sometimes they are calling it fissure, is the intraparietal sulcus, just in the middle of the parietal loop. This is called intraparietal. Okay, now we will see the gyri of the parietal loop. As you can see, there are only 3 of them. So here we will have a very important gyrus, which is the post. This gyrus here is the post-central gyrus. And this one here above the superior parietal, this one above the intraparietal fissure is called the superior parietal lobule, because it's like a lobule of the brain, and the one just lying behind or inferior to the intraparietal fissure, this one here is called the inferior parietal lobule. If we are talking about the important functional areas of the parietal loop, we have to remember this gyrus, which is the precentral gyrus of the brain, as we have here an important area which is called primary sensory area. Primary sensory area, or according to Brodmann classification, it's area 312. It's area 312. It's extending in the post-central gyrus and also extending on the medial surface of the brain on an area called the paracentral lobule, which we will see on the medial side of the brain. The function of this area is to discriminate different sensations. So all sensations of the body, all general sensations as pain, touch, temperature, are going to this area, and this area will identify these sensations. And if we have lesions in this area, we will have a phenomena called contralateral hemianesthesia. It's contralateral because the cerebrum is controlling the opposite side of the body, and hemianesthesia because in this patient he will lose the sensations on one side of the body. The secondary sensory area, as this is the primary sensory area, so we have another area which is very small, is called the secondary sensory area. Is lying here on the lowermost part of the post-central gyrus. This is the secondary sensory area, but it is not important as the primary sensory area has the main function of the perception of sensations of the body. The rest of the parietal lobule, which is the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule, they both have an area called parietal association area or sensory association area. So this area has the function of identifying different sensations. So the primary sensory area is just receive these sensations, and we can know the meaning of these sensations by the parietal association or the sensory association area, which is located in the superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. Here we have the temporal lobe of the brain. This temporal lobe is lying beneath or inferior to the lateral fissure, and here in this lobe we have two parallel sulci. The superior one is called superior temporal sulcus, and the inferior one is called inferior temporal sulcus. These two sulci are separating between three gyri. This gyrus here, which is extending between the lateral fissure and the superior temporal sulcus, is called superior temporal gyrus. And the middle one, which is extending between the superior and the inferior temporal gyri, is called middle. This is the middle temporal gyrus, and lastly the lowermost one is called the inferior temporal gyrus. Here in the middle of this superior temporal gyrus we have a very important area, which is area 41 and area 42 according to Brodmann classification, and this is the primary hearing area or primary auditory area. So here in the middle of the superior frontal gyrus we have the primary auditory area, and this area has the function of perception analysis of different intensities of the sound. And if we have lesion in this sound, we have a diminished or reduction of hearing acuity on both ears, but mainly on the opposite side. And the rest of the parietal loop, this area has the function of interpretation of auditory stimulus, so it knows the meaning of this sound. If we have the sound of a person or a bird, or if this sound is something like harsh or severe or low, this area has a function of interpretation of the auditory stimulus. It's lying in the rest of the temporal loop, and as we mentioned in the lecture, it's called the auditory association area. Auditory association area is lying in the rest of the temporal loop. We have another area which is called Fornix area. This is another language area. Fornix area actually is composed of three areas. The first one is that which is lying around the center, the hearing center. This is the hearing center, the primary area for hearing, and the rest of the superior temporal gyrus is called the hearing association center, hearing association area, or area 22. So this is called area 22, or the hearing association area. Another area which is lying just like here, this is called marginal gyrus. This is marginal gyrus, or area 40. This area is located just above the posterior end of the lateral fissure. And in this area here, which is located in the posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus, this is called angular gyrus. Angular gyrus, or area 39. So area 40 and area 39 and the posterior part of area 22, here we are calling this area the Fornix area. So this is the Fornix area of the brain. Here, the Fornix area of the brain, which is situated between the parietal and temporal loops of the brain. If we have a lesion in this area, we end with a phenomena called Fluent Aphasia or Fornix aphasia. Sometimes we call it receptive aphasia. It's different from the Broca's aphasia or the non-fluent aphasia, in which we have a lesion here in the inferior frontal gyrus, or area 44, sometimes 44 and 45. If we have a lesion in this area, the Broca's area, or the or the inferior temporal, the inferior frontal gyrus, we have a non-fluent aphasia in which the patient cannot articulate different muscles of speech. And if we have a lesion in the posterior part of the parietal lobe and superior part of the temporal lobe, we have Fornix aphasia or receptive aphasia or fluent aphasia. This patient cannot understand both spoken or written words. So he speaks too much, but his speech makes no sense.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to your first online practical session in the neuroanatomy module. In this practical class, you will identify different loops of the brain, sulci, gyri, and important functional areas. And also you can identify the orientation of the brain, which is front, which is back, and the position of the cerebellum and the brainstem to the brain. First of all, we have to identify the location of the brain inside our skull. So this is the skull, and this is the internal surface of the skull. Here, this is the frontal bone, and this is the occipital bone, and these are the temporal bones. This is the brain. As you can see, the brain is divided into two cerebral hemispheres by this longitudinal sulcus or longitudinal fissure. So this is the right cerebral hemisphere, and this is the left cerebral hemisphere. In the posterior part of the brain, you can see this structure. This structure here is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum also is divided into two cerebellar hemispheres, which are joined together through this vermis. In front of the cerebellum, you can see this structure here, which is called brainstem. The brainstem is divided into three parts. The first, or the proximal part, is the midbrain, which sinks inside the material of the brain itself. This is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata. So the orientation of the brain, or the position of the brain inside the skull, is like this. This is the frontal bone, and this is the occipital bone, and here this is the temporal bone. As you can see, the brain itself is divided into loops, and the brain, or the cerebral hemisphere, has three poles. This is the frontal pole, this is the occipital pole, and this is the temporal pole of the brain. Frontal pole, occipital pole, and temporal pole. So if you put the brain inside the skull, the frontal pole is lying inside the frontal bone. The occipital bone is lying inside the occipital bone of the skull, and the temporal pole is lying inside the temporal bone of the skull. Here, as you can see, this foramen here is called the Foramen Magnum. From the important contents of the Foramen Magnum, you have the medulla oblongata. As we mentioned before, the brainstem consists of three anatomical parts. Proximal part is called the midbrain, and then pons, and then the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is lying inside, or it passes from inside the foramen magnum and continues as the spinal cord. Back to the cerebrum. As you can see, the cerebrum is folded into gyri. So these are different gyri, or the elevations on the surface of the brain, which contain the functional area of the body is called gyri. So these elevations are called gyri. These gyri are separated by sulci. So the sulcus is lying between the two gyri. According to the Brodmann classification, we have around 49 gyri of the brain. First of all, we have to identify the loops of the brain. The brain is divided into, or each cerebrum is divided into 4 anatomical loops: the frontal loop, the parietal loop, the occipital loop, and the temporal loop. How can we divide the brain into these 4 loops? We have an important sulcus which is running on the lateral surface of the brain. This sulcus is called the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus of the brain. The central sulcus itself begins 1 centimeter on the medial surface of the brain and runs on the superolateral surface of the brain until it reaches to the inferior border of the brain. We have also this fissure here. It's called fissure because it depth inside the brain tissue. This is called lateral fissure, or exactly the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure, because we have this part here which is called the stem of the lateral fissure. So the stem of the lateral fissure begins on the inferior surface of the brain and curves on the posterior or the superolateral surface of the brain to make this fissure, which is the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure. So we have two important fissures or sulci: the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and this central sulcus. We have also this notch here, which is called, this notch is on the inferior border of the brain. This notch here is called pre-occipital notch, pre-occipital notch, which lies 2 and 5 centimeters in front of the occipital pole of the brain. Also, on the superior border of the brain, you can identify the beginning of a fissure called posterolateral fissure. Parieto-occipital fissure. So this is the beginning of the parieto-occipital fissure, which begins on the lateral surface of the brain and continues on the medial side of the brain, as we will discuss when we reach to the medial side of the brain. So this is the parieto-occipital fissure, and this is the lateral sulcus, this is the central sulcus. Now, if you draw an imaginary line between this pre-occipital notch to the beginning of the parieto-occipital fissure, and another imaginary line between the end of the lateral sulcus to meet this fissure, this imaginary line, the first one, which joins between the parieto-occipital and pre-occipital notch. So you can divide the brain into 4 loops. The part in front of the central sulcus is called the frontal loop. The part of the brain between the central sulcus and the beginning of the parieto-occipital fissure is called parietal loop. Behind the imaginary line, which joins between the parieto-occipital fissure and the pre-occipital notch, this is called the posterior or the occipital loop. And below the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure, this is the temporal lobe of the brain. So you have 4 anatomical loops: the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. You have another 2 important loops of the brain, which are the insula. The insula is lying inside the brain. If you open the lips of the lateral fissure, this part of the brain, which lies inside the depth here, is called the insula. And the limbic lobe of the brain, which lies on the medial side of the brain. As we mentioned, this is the frontal loop, lies in front of the central sulcus of the brain. What are the important sulci and gyri in this loop? In front of the central sulcus, you can identify this sulcus, which runs parallel to the central sulcus. This is called precentral sulcus. Also, you have this sulcus here, which runs from the frontal pole to reach the precentral sulcus. This is called superior frontal sulcus. Downward here, you can find this sulcus, which is called inferior frontal sulcus. So the important sulci which are in the frontal loop are the precentral sulcus, superior and inferior frontal sulci. The gyri which are included in the frontal lobe are this gyrus, which is the precentral gyrus between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus. And this gyrus, the superior frontal gyrus, and This gyrus, which is lying between the superior and inferior frontal gyrus, is called the middle frontal gyrus, and the last one is inferior to the inferior frontal sulcus. This is called inferior frontal gyrus. In the parietal loop, the important gyri and sulci on the parietal loop. This is the central sulcus, as we mentioned before. 1 finger breadth to the posterior part of the central sulcus, you can identify this sulcus, which is the post-central sulcus. So in front of the central sulcus, this is the pre-central sulcus, and behind the central sulcus, this is the post-central sulcus. Also inside the substance itself of the parietal loop, you can identify this deep fissure, which separates the parietal loop into upper part and lower part. This is called intraparietal sulcus or intraparietal fissure. So you have the post-central sulcus and the intraparietal sulcus. Important gyri, which are situated on the parietal loop of the brain. Between the central and post-central sulcus, this area here is very important, and it is called the post-central gyrus. So this is the pre-central gyrus, and this is the post-central gyrus. Here, superior to the intraparietal sulcus, this area here is called the superior parietal lobule, and below the intraparietal fissure, this area is called the inferior parietal lobule. So we have the post-central, superior, and inferior parietal lobules. The occipital loop of the brain is the most posterior loop of the brain, between the parieto-occipital fissure and the pre-occipital notch, as we draw the imaginary line. So this is the occipital loop of the brain. This sulcus here inside the occipital loop of the brain, this one is called transverse occipital sulcus. So this is the transverse occipital sulcus of the brain. These are the important sulci and gyri on the frontal, parietal, and occipital. This is the temporal loop of the brain. The temporal loop of the brain is lying below the posterior ramus of the lateral fissure. You can identify these 2 sulci. The first one is the superior temporal sulcus. The second one is the inferior temporal sulcus. These 2 sulci divide the temporal loop into 3 gyri. This is the superior temporal gyrus, this is the middle temporal gyrus, and this is the inferior temporal gyrus. Superior, middle, inferior temporal gyri of the brain. Now, if we are discussing the functional areas or the important functional areas of the brain, so between the central sulcus and the pre-central sulcus, this is the pre-central gyrus. Here you can identify the motor area of the body, which gives origin to the pyramidal tract. This pyramidal tract is controlling the opposite side of the body. The body is represented upside down on this area. This is the head area, this is the trunk area, and on the most superior part of the area, here we have the lower limb area, and also it curves on the medial surface of the brain on a gyrus called paracentral lobule. The paracentral lobule is the continuation of both precentral and postcentral gyri on the medial side around the central sulcus of the brain. So this is the motor area according to the Brodmann classification. We are calling this motor area 4. In front of the motor area, we can identify this triangular area here. This is called premotor area. Premotor area is like inverted triangle. The base of the triangle begins on the superior or the upper border, the medial border of the brain, and the apex of the triangle is directed downward. So the premotor area is occupying part of the posterior end of the superior frontal gyrus and part of the posterior end of the middle frontal gyrus. This premotor area, according to Brodmann, it's called premotor area 6, gives origin to the extrapyramidal tracts. Also, it sends afferents to the motor area 4. In the middle frontal gyrus, you can identify here, in the middle frontal gyrus, Frontal Eye Field area or area 8. Here is lying the Frontal Eye Field area in the middle frontal gyrus. In the inferior frontal gyrus, here, this gyrus is occupied by motor area or Broca's area of speech, area 44 and 45, which controls and coordinate different muscles of speech. So motor area 4, premotor area 6, frontal eye field area, Broca's area of speech. In the parietal loop, this is the central sulcus. Here, this is the central sulcus, and this is the post-central sulcus, and this is the post-central gyrus. The post-central gyrus is occupied by the primary sensory area of the body, area 312. This is the primary sensory area of the body. Also, the body is represented upside down in this area. The head is occupying the lowermost part of the post-central gyrus, then the trunk and the lower limb area also is extending to the medial side on the paracentral lobule around the beginning of the central sulcus on the medial surface of the brain. The rest of the parietal loop is called sensory association area. Sensory association means the perception of the stimulus itself is occurring on the post-central gyrus, but we know the meaning of these different stimuli or these different sensations by the association area. So here we have the parietal association area by which we are understanding the meaning of different stimuli. The occipital loop, the area on the occipital loop is lying on the medial surface of the brain, which is the primary visual area around a sulcus called calcarine sulcus, as we will see when we are describing the sulci and gyri on the medial surface of the brain. The temporal loop of the brain, we have the superior temporal loop, superior temporal gyrus. This gyrus here, in the middle of this gyrus, here, we have the primary auditory area. The primary auditory area, area 41 and 42. The rest of the temporal, superior temporal gyrus, sometimes it extends to the middle temporal as well, is called auditory association area. So in the middle of the superior temporal gyrus, the stimulus is perceived by this auditory area, and the rest of the temporal or the superior temporal gyrus gives meaning to these auditory sensations or auditory stimuli and is called the auditory association area. Also, the temporal loop itself has a great function in memory. So these are sulci and gyri, which are situated on the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital loop, which are lying on the lateral surface of the brain.